The USS Liberty moved through space like a silver arrow cutting through the darkness between stars, and Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, watching the massive space station grow larger on the main screen with each passing minute, while his crew worked quietly at their stations preparing for what would be the most important diplomatic mission in human history. And he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket, because this meeting would decide humanity's future among the stars, and whether Earth would join the galactic community or remain isolated forever on the edge of known space. Ambassador Lisa Carter walked onto the bridge carrying a data pad filled with information about the 12 species that ruled the galaxy through something called the Galactic Council, and she looked nervous, which was unusual for someone who had spent 20 years negotiating trade deals and peace treaties across human space. But this was different because no human had ever stood before the council chambers and spoken for their entire species, while representing billions of people back on Earth and the growing colonies scattered across nearby star systems. The space station called Nexus Prime filled the entire view screen now, and Morrison could see it was bigger than any human city with docking bays that could hold 1,000 ships and towers that stretched into space like metal mountains reaching toward distant stars while lights blinked along its surface like jewels scattered across black fabric, and he knew that inside those corridors walked beings from across the galaxy who had been traveling between worlds when humans were still learning to make fire and build simple tools. Carter moved to stand beside Morrison and pointed at different sections of the station while explaining what she had learned from the few traders who had contact with council species, and told him that the central tower housed the council chambers where 12 ancient races made decisions that affected trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds, and that no species had been granted full membership in the council for over 300 years, despite dozens of applications from younger civilizations who wanted a voice in galactic affairs. Dr. Alex Turner joined them at the observation window and adjusted his glasses while studying the alien ships docked at the station and pointing out the different designs that showed how each species had solved the problems of space travel in their own unique ways, with some ships looking like crystalline sculptures that caught and reflected starlight, while others resembled massive metal beasts with armor plating and weapon ports that could destroy entire fleets, and still others appeared to be grown rather than built with organic curves and surfaces that pulsed with their own inner light. The communications officer, Lieutenant Danny Blake, called out that they were receiving docking instructions from station control, and Morrison ordered the helmsman to follow the guidance signals, while Carter explained that the Council had sent an unprecedented invitation to Earth, asking humanity to present themselves for evaluation as potential members, which had surprised everyone in the Earth government, because most species waited centuries before receiving such an opportunity, and some never received it at all, despite having advanced technology and peaceful intentions. As the Liberty moved through the docking sequence, Morrison noticed how the other ships gave them a wide berth, and he wondered if it was normal protocol or if the alien crews were curious about the newest species to arrive at this ancient meeting place where the fate of civilizations was decided by beings who had been making such choices since before Earth had developed complex life. And Carter mentioned that according to her briefings, the Council species had been working together for over 800 years and had created the longest period of galactic peace in recorded history. The docking clamps engaged with a solid thunk that echoed through the ship, and Morrison gave orders for a skeleton crew to remain aboard while the diplomatic team prepared to disembark, and he checked his dress uniform one final time, knowing that first impressions would be crucial when dealing with beings who had been evaluating younger species for centuries and had developed their own ideas about which civilizations deserved to join their exclusive group. Carter gathered her team of advisors and translators, while Dr. Turner collected his equipment for studying alien biology and psychology, because he wanted to understand how the different council species thought and made decisions, and Blake organized the security detail that would accompany them through the station corridors, where they might encounter beings whose intentions toward humanity remained unknown, and whose capabilities far exceeded anything Earth could currently match in terms of technology or military power. The airlock opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Morrison stepped onto the station deck feeling artificial gravity that was slightly lighter than Earth normal, while breathing recycled air that carried unfamiliar scents from dozens of different worlds, and he saw beings walking through the corridors who looked nothing like humans, with some having multiple arms and others appearing to float rather than walk while their translators converted alien languages into words he could understand. A tall figure approached them wearing robes that seemed to shift color as it moved, and Carter whispered that this was their assigned guide, who would escort them to their quarters and brief them on council procedures. And Morrison noticed how other beings stopped their conversations to stare at the human delegation as they passed through corridors lined with artwork and displays from hundreds of different cultures and civilizations that had contributed to the galactic community over the centuries. Their quarters were larger than expected, with viewing ports that showed the vast expanse of space beyond the station, and Carter immediately began reviewing her presentation materials while Dr. Turner set up his observation equipment, and Blake checked the security arrangements, and Morrison stood at the window, looking out at the stars, and thinking about how Earth had come so far in just 50 years since developing faster than light travel, and wondering if humanity was truly ready to take its place among the ancient powers that ruled the galaxy. The next morning would bring their first formal meeting with the Council. Representatives and Morrison knew that everything they said and did would be analyzed and judged by beings who had been making such evaluations for longer than human civilization had existed, and he felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he prepared for what could be humanity's greatest triumph, or its most devastating rejection by the powers that controlled the space between the stars. The council chambers were even more impressive than Morrison had imagined, with walls made of some kind of crystal that seemed to glow from within, and 12 elevated seats arranged in a circle around a central platform where Ambassador Carter would present humanity's case for membership, and each seat was designed for a different species, with some being much larger than others, and some having environmental controls that created different atmospheres for beings who breathed different gases or lived at different temperatures than humans could survive. Chancellor Thexvar of the Zinthari Collective called the session to order, and his voice came through Morrison's translator as cold and precise, like a computer reading data, and he explained that they were gathered to evaluate humanity's application for council membership, which would grant Earth full voting rights and access to advanced technologies and trade networks that connected thousands of worlds across the galaxy. But Morrison noticed something in the Chancellor's tone that suggested this was merely a formality, rather than a genuine evaluation. Carter stepped onto the central platform and began her presentation with confidence, born from years of diplomatic experience, and she outlined humanity's achievements in space exploration and colonization, and their contributions to galactic security through their conflicts with the Void Seekers, who had been raiding the outer systems and threatening peaceful civilizations, and she emphasized Earth's commitment to peace and cooperation, and their desire to work with other species for the benefit of all beings. In the Galaxy War, Commander Zepheos of the Veltar Empire interrupted Carter's presentation with a harsh laugh that sounded like grinding metal, and he questioned humanity's military capabilities and strategies, and claimed that their defensive tactics against the Void Seekers were primitive and ineffective, despite the fact that human forces had successfully repelled 3 major incursions and protected several non-aligned worlds from destruction. And Morrison felt his anger rising at the dismissive tone, but forced himself to remain calm and professional. Trade Minister Quintel of the Orion Syndicate spoke next, and his multiple eyes focused on Carter with obvious skepticism, while he dismissed Earth's economic contributions as negligible and claimed that human colonies produced nothing of real value to the galactic economy, despite the fact that Earth's mining operations supplied nearly a quarter of the rare Earth elements needed for advanced technology, and their agricultural worlds had helped feed dozens of developing civilizations during recent famines and food shortages. Dr. Turner leaned forward in his observer's seat and quietly took notes on each council member's behavior and responses, and he began to see patterns in their questions and objections that suggested they had already decided to reject humanity's application and were simply going through the motions of a hearing while looking for justifications for their predetermined decision. And he noticed how they seemed to coordinate their attacks on different aspects of Carter's presentation, as if they had planned their strategy in advance. The representative from the Aquan Federation raised concerns about humanity's environmental record and pointed to damage caused by early industrial development on Earth, while ignoring the massive restoration projects and clean energy initiatives that had transformed the planet over the past century. And the Christech Consortium questioned human psychological stability, and claimed that their aggressive tendencies made them unsuitable for peaceful galactic cooperation despite overwhelming evidence of human diplomatic success and peaceful expansion. Carter tried to address each concern with facts and evidence, but Morrison could see that the council members were not really listening to her responses, and instead seemed to be waiting for their turns to raise new objections and complaints, and he began to understand that this was not a fair evaluation, but rather a predetermined rejection disguised as a formal hearing, and he felt frustrated and angry at the obvious manipulation of what should have been an honest assessment. During the lunch recess, Carter gathered her team in a private conference room and expressed her growing suspicions about the council's true intentions, and Blake reported that his security sweeps had detected surveillance equipment in their quarters and meeting spaces, which suggested that the council was monitoring their private conversations, and Dr. Turner shared his observations about the coordinated nature of the objections and how they seemed designed to exclude rather than evaluate. Carter decided to use the afternoon break to do some research of her own, and she accessed the station's public records database to review previous membership applications. And what she found was shocking because the records showed that the council had rejected the last 47 species who had applied for membership over the past 2 centuries, and in each case they had found similar objections and concerns that seemed to follow the same pattern of criticism and dismissal. Blake used his intelligence training to dig deeper into the council's private communications, and while he could not access their encrypted channels, he was able to monitor their public schedules and movements, and he discovered that the 12 council members had been meeting secretly every evening since the human delegation arrived, and these meetings were not listed on any official schedule, which suggested they were coordinating their strategy against humanity's application. Dr. Turner made another disturbing discovery when he analyzed the economic data that the council claimed showed human contributions were negligible, and he found that they had deliberately excluded several major categories of human production and trade, while using outdated figures that did not reflect current reality. And when he calculated the actual numbers, he found that human colonies were among the most productive in the galaxy, and their trade relationships had brought prosperity to dozens of previously struggling worlds. The afternoon session continued with more of the same coordinated attacks on humanity's qualifications, and Morrison watched Carter's growing frustration as she tried to defend her species against accusations that seemed designed to be impossible to refute. And the council members interrupted her responses and dismissed her evidence and treated her with barely concealed contempt that would have been considered insulting in any human diplomatic setting. As the day wore on, Morrison began to see the bigger picture that Dr. Turner and Blake had uncovered, and he realized that the council was not just rejecting humanity, but was actively working to maintain their exclusive control over galactic affairs, and that they had been doing this for centuries while pretending to offer membership opportunities to younger species who could never meet their constantly shifting and impossible standards. The session ended with Chancellor Thexvar announcing that the council would deliberate overnight and present their decision the following morning, and Carter knew that the decision had already been made, and that the deliberation was just another part of the charade, but she maintained her diplomatic composure and thanked the council for their time and consideration, while Morrison struggled to contain his anger at the obvious corruption and bias he had witnessed. That evening, the human delegation met in Morrison's quarters to discuss their options, and Carter admitted that she had never encountered such blatant prejudice and manipulation in her diplomatic career, and Blake reported that his monitoring had detected increased communication traffic between council members and their home governments, which suggested they were coordinating not just their rejection of humanity, but their response to any human protests or appeals. Dr. Turner presented his analysis of the council's behavior patterns and concluded that they were dealing with a system that had become completely corrupt and self-serving, and that maintained power by excluding any species that might challenge their authority or offer alternative perspectives on galactic governance, and he warned that accepting second-class status would trap humanity in a system designed to exploit rather than serve the galaxy's diverse populations. Morrison looked out at the stars and thought about the billions of humans back on Earth and the colonies who were counting on this mission to secure their future among the galactic community. And he knew that they were facing a choice between accepting a rigged system or challenging the most powerful forces in the known galaxy, and he wondered if humanity had the strength and courage to stand up to beings who had been ruling the stars for longer than human civilization had existed. The second day of hearings began with Chancellor Thexavar announcing the Council's decision with the same cold precision he had shown throughout the proceedings, and Morrison could see the satisfaction in his crystalline features as he explained that while humanity showed promise, they were not yet ready for full Council membership, and would instead be offered permanent probationary status which would grant them limited trade rights and restricted access to certain technologies while requiring them to submit all military actions to Council approval. Ambassador Carter listened to the terms with growing disbelief, because permanent probationary status was essentially second-class citizenship that would keep humanity forever dependent on the Council's goodwill, while providing none of the benefits that came with actual membership, and the restrictions on military action would leave Earth defenseless against future Void-Seeker attacks unless the Council chose to provide assistance, which they could withdraw at any time, for any reason they deemed appropriate. War Commander Zepheos elaborated on the military restrictions, with obvious pleasure explaining that human forces would be limited to defensive actions within their own territory and could not engage in any operations beyond their current borders without prior Council approval, and that all human weapons technology would be subject to Council inspection and regulation, which effectively meant that Earth's military would become a subsidiary force under Council control, rather than an independent defense organization. Trade Minister Quintel outlined the economic terms, which were even more restrictive than the military ones, because humanity would be required to sell all rare Earth elements and advanced materials exclusively to Council-approved buyers, at prices set by the Council itself, and human colonies would be prohibited from establishing direct trade relationships with non-Council species, which would force all commerce to go through Council-controlled intermediaries who would take substantial profits from every transaction. Dr. Turner noticed that several of the Council members seemed uncomfortable with the harsh terms being offered, and he wondered if some of them had objections to the obviously exploitative nature of the agreement. But none of them spoke up to challenge their colleagues, and he realized that even if some Council members had doubts about their policies, they were too invested in the system to risk opposing it openly. Carter was given 24 hours to respond to the Council's offer, and Chancellor Thexvar made it clear that this was a generous proposal that many species would be grateful to receive, and that rejection would result in humanity being classified as a non-aligned civilization with no access to Council space or protection, and he emphasized that the galaxy was a dangerous place for species that tried to stand alone against the various threats that existed beyond the civilized worlds. That evening, Carter called an emergency meeting of the human delegation in the most secure room they could find, and she began by stating that the Council's offer was completely unacceptable because it would trap humanity in a subordinate position forever and make Earth dependent on beings who had already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate and exploit younger species for their own benefit. And she said that accepting these terms would be a betrayal of every human who had died fighting for freedom and independence. Captain Morrison argued strongly for rejecting the offer outright, and declared that humanity had survived and thrived for thousands of years without alien assistance, and could continue to do so even if it meant remaining isolated from the galactic community. And he pointed out that humans had already proven their ability to defend themselves against the Void-Seekers and had developed faster-than-light travel independently, which showed they did not need Council technology to advance. Dr. Turner warned that complete isolation would severely limit humanity's expansion into space, because the Council controlled access to most of the galaxy's trade routes and resources, and that Earth's colonies would struggle to develop without access to the advanced technologies and materials that came through Council-controlled networks, and he feared that isolation could doom human civilization to stagnation. On the edge of galactic society, the debate continued for hours, with each member of the delegation expressing their views on the impossible choice they faced, and Blake reported that his intelligence gathering had revealed how other species had fared under probationary status, and the results were uniformly discouraging because none of them had ever advanced to full membership, despite decades or even centuries of compliance with Council demands and restrictions. Carter was studying the Council's own charter documents when she discovered something that changed everything, and she called the others over to look at a section of the original founding agreement that had been written 800 years ago when the Council was first Established and hidden in the archaic legal language was a provision that had apparently been forgotten by the current council members. The provision stated that any galactic species could call for a vote of confidence in the council's leadership, but it required a 2/3 majority of all recognized galactic species, not just the 12 council members. And Carter realized that this meant the hundreds of non-council species scattered across the galaxy could theoretically remove the current leadership if they could be organized and convinced to act together. Blake immediately saw the potential of this discovery and pointed out that no one had ever attempted to use this provision because the logistics of contacting and coordinating hundreds of different species across vast distances seemed impossible. But humanity had advantages that previous generations had lacked, including faster communication technology and a natural talent for organizing grassroots movements and building coalitions. Dr. Turner was excited by the psychological implications because his research had shown that many non-council species harbored resentment toward the current system, but had never believed they could challenge it effectively, and a vote of confidence could provide them with a legal framework for expressing their discontent and demanding change without being accused of rebellion or sedition. Morrison understood the enormous risks involved because if they attempted to organize a vote of confidence and failed, humanity would be branded as troublemakers and revolutionaries, and would face the combined military might of all 12 council species, who would see Earth as a threat to their continued dominance. And he knew that the consequences of failure could include the destruction of human civilization. Carter spent the night reviewing legal precedents and constitutional interpretations while trying to determine if the vote of confidence provision was still valid and legally binding. And she discovered that the council had never formally repealed or modified this section of their charter, which meant it remained in effect, even though it had never been used and could not be dismissed as obsolete or irrelevant. The next morning, Carter made her decision, and she knew it was the most important choice of her career, and possibly the most significant moment in human history, because she was about to commit her species to a course of action that would either transform the galaxy or lead to humanity's destruction. And she felt the weight of billions of lives depending on her judgment and courage. She walked into the council chambers with her head held high and her voice steady as she addressed the 12 ancient beings who had ruled the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed, and she thanked them for their generous offer of probationary status, but respectfully declined their terms and instead announced that humanity was invoking the vote of confidence provision contained in Article 7 of the original council charter. The reaction was immediate and explosive, with Chancellor Thexvar rising from his crystalline throne and declaring the vote illegal and unauthorized, while War Commander Zephyos accused Carter of sedition and threatened military action against Earth. And the other council members erupted in angry protests and demands that the humans be expelled from the station immediately for their outrageous breach of protocol. But Carter had done her homework, and she calmly cited the exact legal language that gave any galactic species the right to call for such a vote. And when the council's own legal advisors confirmed that the provision was indeed valid and binding, the chambers fell into stunned silence as the implications of what Carter had done began to sink in. And everyone realized that for the first time in 8 centuries, the council's absolute authority was being challenged through their own legal system. Morrison watched from the observation gallery as Carter explained that humanity would spend the next 30 galactic standard days contacting every recognized species in the galaxy and asking them to support a vote of confidence in the current council leadership, and she made it clear that this was not an attack on the concept of galactic governance, but rather an attempt to create a more fair and representative system that served all species, rather than just the privileged few. The council members sat in shocked silence as they realized that their own ancient laws had provided a weapon that could be used against them, and that a species they had dismissed as primitive and unworthy had found a way to challenge their power using the very documents they had created to legitimize their rule 8 centuries ago, when the galaxy was a very different place. The announcement of the vote of confidence sent shockwaves through the council chambers and beyond, as news of humanity's unprecedented challenge spread across the galaxy through communication networks that had never carried such explosive information. And within hours, every species from the core worlds to the outer rim had heard that a young civilization had dared to invoke an ancient law that could topple the government that had ruled them for 8 centuries. Chancellor Thexvar immediately declared the vote illegal and demanded that station security arrest the human delegation for sedition. But the Council's own legal department confirmed that Carter had correctly cited valid constitutional law and that preventing the vote would require the Council to openly violate their own charter, which would undermine the legal foundation of their authority and potentially trigger widespread rebellion across their territory. Captain Morrison received urgent orders from Earth to maintain the delegation's safety at all costs while Carter and her team prepared for what would be the most ambitious diplomatic campaign in galactic history, because they had just 30 standard days to contact every recognized species in the galaxy and convince them to support a vote of confidence against the most powerful government in known space. Dr. Turner immediately began analyzing the psychological and cultural factors that would influence each species' decision, because humanity needed to understand what motivated the hundreds of different civilizations they would be approaching, and what arguments would be most effective in convincing them to risk the Council's wrath by supporting fundamental political change. Lieutenant Blake coordinated with Earth's intelligence services to establish a massive communication network that could reach every corner of the galaxy simultaneously, because traditional diplomatic channels would be monitored and controlled by the Council, and humanity needed secure ways to contact species who had never spoken directly with humans before. Carter knew that conventional galactic diplomacy moved slowly through formal protocols and lengthy negotiations that could take years to complete, but humanity had only 30 days to accomplish what had never been attempted before, and she decided that desperate times required revolutionary methods that would shock the ancient powers with their speed and directness. The human approach was radically different from anything the galaxy had seen before, because instead of working through official government channels and diplomatic hierarchies, Carter's team used every available communication method to reach ordinary citizens and local leaders, and grassroots organizations who had never been consulted about galactic governance but would be affected by the outcome of the vote. Morrison dispatched every available human ship to carry diplomatic teams to the farthest reaches of known space, while Earth's communication arrays transmitted messages in hundreds of different languages explaining the vote of confidence and asking for support from species who had been excluded from galactic decision-making for centuries, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The first breakthrough came from the Kalari artisan worlds, where skilled craftsmen had been forced to sell their advanced technological innovations exclusively to Orion Syndicate representatives at prices far below their true value, and when they learned that the vote could break the monopolies that kept them impoverished, they immediately pledged their support and began organizing their entire sector. Similar stories emerged from across the galaxy as species after species revealed how the Council had exploited their resources and suppressed their development through trade restrictions and technological controls, and the Nexan agricultural worlds disclosed how Xanthari corporations had forced them to use inferior farming methods that kept them dependent on Council fertilizers and equipment. The Threx Mining Confederation provided devastating evidence of how Veltar Empire had strip-mined entire worlds for rare minerals, while leaving the inhabitants with poisoned environments and no compensation, and their detailed records showed a pattern of environmental destruction and exploitation that violated dozens of galactic treaties and ethical standards. Blake's intelligence network grew exponentially as oppressed species began sharing information about Council corruption and abuse that had been hidden for decades, and the evidence painted a picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond what even Carter had suspected. When she first noticed the rigged membership process, the Council fought back with increasing desperation as they realized that their centuries of control were threatened by this unprecedented challenge, and War Commander Zephaeos issued military threats against any species that supported the vote, while Trade Minister Quintel imposed economic sanctions and trade restrictions designed to punish early supporters. But the Council's heavy-handed responses only validated the accusations against them and proved that they ruled through fear and intimidation rather than consent and cooperation, and each new threat or punishment drove more species to join the growing coalition that was demanding fundamental change in galactic governance. Dr. Turner noticed that the psychological impact of the vote went far beyond its immediate political implications, because for the first time in centuries, the galaxy's oppressed populations believed that change was possible and that they could challenge the ancient powers without being destroyed. and this hope spread like wildfire through communication networks that the Council could not control. The momentum built steadily as species that had never cooperated before began working together to support the vote and share resources and information, and Carter watched in amazement as a truly galactic democracy began to emerge organically from the grassroots organizing that her challenge had unleashed across hundreds of worlds. Morrison received daily reports from human diplomatic teams who were being welcomed as liberators by populations who had never imagined that anyone would challenge the Council's authority, and he realized that humanity had accidentally triggered a revolution that went far beyond their original goal of gaining Council membership. The ancient Council species found themselves increasingly isolated as their traditional allies began questioning the legitimacy of a system that had never been subjected to democratic oversight, and several non-Council species that had previously supported the status quo announced their intention to vote for change. With only days remaining before the vote, Chancellor Thexvar made a desperate attempt to preserve the old system by offering minor reforms and limited representation for non-Council species. But it was too late, because the galactic population had tasted the possibility of real democracy and would not settle for cosmetic changes that left the fundamental power structure intact. Carter knew that they had already won something greater than Council membership, because they had awakened the galaxy to the possibility of self-governance and democratic participation in decisions that affected their lives. And whether the vote succeeded or failed, the old system of unaccountable rule by ancient elites could never be restored. The final days before the vote saw frantic activity as species across the galaxy organized transportation to Nexus Prime so their representatives could participate in what everyone understood would be the most important political event in galactic history, and Morrison watched ships arriving from every corner of known space, carrying delegates who had never before been invited to participate in galactic governance. As the vote approached, it became clear that this was more than a challenge to the current Council, but rather a fundamental transformation of galactic civilization from an oligarchy ruled by 12 ancient species to a democratic assembly where every voice could be heard, and every species could participate as equals in shaping their common future among the stars. The crystalline amphitheater that had once held only 12 ancient rulers was now packed with representatives from 447 galactic species who had traveled from every corner of known space to participate in the most important vote in galactic history, and Captain Morrison watched from the observation deck as beings who had never before been invited to participate in galactic governance took their seats as equals in a chamber that symbolized 8 centuries of oligarchic rule. Ambassador Carter stood at the central podium, where she had first presented humanity's case for Council membership just weeks ago, but now she faced a completely different audience, because instead of 12 dismissive autocrats who had already decided to reject her species, she was addressing hundreds of representatives who had come to Nexus Prime because they believed that change was not only possible, but necessary for the survival of galactic civilization. Chancellor Thexvar made one final desperate attempt to preserve the old system, and he spoke about the stability and peace that the Council had maintained for 800 years, and warned that democratic governance would lead to chaos and conflict as hundreds of different species with competing interests tried to reach consensus on complex galactic issues. But War Commander Zephaeus undermined his colleagues' arguments when he threatened military action against any species that voted to dissolve the Council, and his barely controlled rage demonstrated exactly why the old system had become corrupt and abusive, because it depended on fear and intimidation rather than consent and cooperation from the galactic population. Trade Minister Quintel tried a different approach and offered economic incentives to species that would support maintaining the current system, but his obvious bribery attempt only reinforced the accusations of corruption that had driven so many civilizations to support the vote of confidence, and several delegates walked out in disgust at his crude attempt to buy their votes. Carter's response was devastating, because she presented the evidence that Blake's intelligence network had gathered over the past month, and she read testimony after testimony from species who had been exploited and oppressed by the Council system, while the ancient rulers sat in stunned silence as their centuries of abuse were exposed before the entire galaxy. Dr. Turner had helped Carter organize her presentation to maximum psychological effect, and she began with the Kalari artisans, who described how their technological innovations had been stolen and sold by Orion Syndicate corporations, and then moved to the Nexan farmers, who explained how Xanthari agricultural monopolies had kept their worlds impoverished despite their fertile soil and advanced farming knowledge. The Threx miners provided the most damning evidence when their representative displayed images of worlds that had been strip-mined by Veltar operations and left as barren wastelands where nothing could grow, and millions of beings had been forced to relocate because their home planets had been rendered uninhabitable by Council-approved resource extraction. Morrison noticed that even some of the Council species' own delegates looked uncomfortable as they heard testimony about actions taken in their names by governments they had never been allowed to question, and he realized that the democratic awakening was spreading even to the core worlds that had benefited most from the old system. Carter concluded her presentation by outlining humanity's vision for a new galactic assembly with rotating leadership and term limits and equal representation for all member species. And she emphasized that this was not about replacing one set of rulers with another, but about eliminating the concept of permanent rulers entirely and creating a government that derived its authority from the consent of the governed. The vote itself was conducted using the Council's own legal procedures, but on a scale that had never been attempted before, as representatives from hundreds of species cast their ballots using translation devices that converted their responses into a standard format that could be counted and verified by neutral observers from several different civilizations. The tension in the chamber was incredible as the votes were tallied and announced by species alphabetically, and Morrison watched Carter's face as the numbers climbed steadily in favor of the no-confidence measure, and it became clear that the margin would be much larger than the required two-thirds majority. When the final tally was announced, the result was overwhelming, with 312 species voting in favor of dissolving the Council, and only 68 voting to maintain the current system, and the remaining delegates abstained. But the message was unmistakable that the galactic population had decisively rejected the oligarchic system that had ruled them for 8 centuries. Chancellor Thexfar sat in shocked silence as the implications of the vote sank in, and he realized that his government had just been democratically removed from power by the foul, very beings they had claimed to represent and protect in war. Commander Zephyos looked around the chamber, as if he could not believe that his military threats had failed to intimidate the assembled delegates. The immediate aftermath of the vote was remarkably peaceful, because the delegates had come prepared for this moment, and they quickly moved to establish temporary procedures for governing the galaxy during the transition to a new system, and Carter found herself nominated and elected as the first speaker of the Galactic Assembly with a mandate to oversee the creation of democratic institutions. Morrison watched from the observation deck as history was made in real time, and he realized that humanity had not just gained membership in the galactic community, but had fundamentally transformed the nature of that community by introducing concepts that had been alien to galactic civilization for centuries, including grassroots organizing and mass communication, and the radical idea that governmental legitimacy came from popular consent. The work of building the new system began immediately, as committees were formed to draft a constitution and establish procedures for democratic governance and representation, and Morrison was amazed at how quickly the assembled delegates adapted to concepts like majority rule and minority rights and checks and balances that humans took for granted, but were revolutionary innovations in galactic politics. Dr. Turner observed that the psychological transformation was as important as the political one, because beings who had spent their entire lives as subjects of an unaccountable government were learning to think of themselves as citizens with rights and responsibilities, and the confidence and energy this generated was visible throughout the station, as species that had never cooperated before began working together as equals. The former council species were not excluded from the new system, but they were no longer rulers, and instead became participants in a democratic process where their votes counted the same as those of species they had previously dismissed as inferior, and some adapted to this change better than others, with a few embracing the new opportunities for cooperation while others retreated to their homeworlds in bitter resentment. Blake reported that communication networks across the galaxy were buzzing with excitement as the news of the vote spread, and billions of beings who had never before had a voice in galactic governance, began organizing local assemblies and discussing issues that affected their daily lives. And he realized that the democratic revolution would continue long after the formal transition was complete. Carter's first acts as speaker included establishing a permanent assembly hall on Nexus Prime that could accommodate representatives from all member species, and creating communication systems that would allow democratic participation even for civilizations in the most remote parts of the galaxy. And she worked tirelessly to ensure that the new system would be truly inclusive and representative. As the USS Liberty prepared to depart Nexus Prime, Morrison reflected on what they had accomplished, and he realized that they had come seeking membership in an exclusive club and instead had democratized the galaxy and given every species a voice in their common future, and the transformation would continue for generations as democratic ideals spread to worlds that had never imagined such possibilities. The final scene showed Morrison receiving a transmission from Earth that listed hundreds of species requesting cultural exchanges and technological partnerships and mutual defense agreements, but not as subjects seeking favors from a ruling power, but as equals in a democratic community. And he understood that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization was not their technology or military capability, but their unwavering belief that all beings deserve to govern themselves. The story ended with Carter addressing the first full session of the Galactic Assembly, and she spoke about the long journey ahead as they worked to build institutions that could serve the needs of hundreds of different species while maintaining the democratic principles that had made their revolution possible. And she concluded by saying that the vote that broke the Galactic Council was not just humanity's first act as a galactic power, but their gift to every being who had been waiting centuries for someone to say that the old ways were not good enough anymore.